Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Personnel Board meeting for January 21st, 2020. Open the meeting with a pledge of allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Roll call vote.
Rose Volker.
Mary Beth Margiotti.
Peter Fox.
Joan Gardecki.
Thank you. First order of business is to accept the November 19th board's minutes that we did not vote on in December because of the cancellation of the meeting because of the storm. Has everybody had a chance to read it?
Yes.
Yes.
Do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion to accept the minutes of the November 19th, 2019 meeting.
Okay, a second?
I wasn't at the meeting.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. Item number 2. Wage study presentation from D.I. Jacobs Consulting. If you'd introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and you can get started.
Sure. My name's Don Jacobs. I'll give you a little bit of information about my background. I always like to say that I've been in the business of local government now for, believe it or not, about 40 years. Every time I say that, I think 40 years is a long time. But for the last 20 years, I've had my own municipal consulting company, and I spend probably almost all of my time, frankly, working with strictly cities and towns on the basic issue of how to manage compensation. I always like to share with you that in my experience in the last 20 years, if I've learned anything from working with numerous municipalities all around the United States, not just here in Massachusetts, compensation is the one issue, frankly. You know, whether you describe it as the glass half full or half empty, depending upon how you want to look at the issue of managing compensation, in my personal experience, without a doubt, it's the hardest thing to do. No question in my mind. And as I said, I've been in the business of local government for quite a long period of time, both as a former town manager, I always like to say in a prior lifetime, meaning a long time ago. In the interest of full disclosure, you know, well, you're probably thinking, well, where was he a town manager? Well, maybe you're not thinking that, I don't know. But I started in Amherst back in the mid-'70s, and I was the town manager in Southbridge from 81 to 85, and then after about a 12-year hiatus where I managed Shawmut Bank's municipal finance department, those of you that remember Shawmut Bank, then I went back as a town manager in Plymouth, and I left Plymouth in 2000, and that's when I formed my own company. That's when I started doing consulting work. And I quickly discovered, as I just said, that compensation is the one aspect of local government that, you know, frankly, you could say, depending upon which way you want to look at it, it's relatively routine, commonplace. It occurs frequently where municipalities, for whatever the reasons, say, you know, we want to either bring someone in or we want to review how we're currently paying positions and employees, and I'd like to think, although it's just my opinion, we want to do it better, whatever better, frankly, might mean. But the point is that it is the one issue in local government that happens all the time. And I can say that having been on both sides of the table, you know, having to make these kinds of decisions relative to paying positions and paying employees, and obviously as a consultant, as an outsider, I come into the town of Dudley, and it could be anywhere, frankly. If there's one thing that I've learned more so than almost anything else that right up front I want to share with you is how critically important, the number one characteristic, by far, not even close, there is no close second. The number one issue is always, always, always communication and the lack of it. That is the number one problem. It's not cost. In other words, how you spend the money obviously is an important question, but I would submit to you that that's not really the issue that's in front of us right at the moment. The issue right in the moment is, well, how do you want to do this? How do you want to pay positions, and how do you want to pay employees? And once you've developed a process, which I think is the key word to use a way to do this, then the question is, how do you want to spend the money based on what you can afford? So the money aspect, right at the beginning, I want to encourage you to put aside for the time being. That's not what we're talking about this morning. So I've done almost, as I said to John when I met with him before, I've probably done almost 150, believe it or not, so-called classification compensation studies. The word classification means to compare positions to one another, not just based on dollars and cents. And compensation really means two things. It means how to pay a position, and then secondly, how to pay an employee. So it's both, okay? So when I say I've done a lot of these kinds of studies, although roughly 150 some odd studies, probably 2/3 of them, 3/4 of them, whatever, have been here in Massachusetts. I live in Holden, where I've lived for like the last 35 years, but I've had a chance to do this work again in lots of places, primarily up and down the East Coast, but the bulk of them, the overwhelming majority of them, have been here in New England, and of that, 90% of the New England studies have been here in Massachusetts. So I've been in Massachusetts, really since 1977. So I'm very, very familiar with Massachusetts from a lot of different perspectives. But again, as I said a minute ago, whether I'm in Dudley or some other community in another state, it really doesn't make any difference relative to understanding what are the most important issues that I think really have a direct effect on how you pay positions and employees. So that experience I try to bring to you. Having worked with, as many as roughly 150 different sizes, shapes, and forms, cities, towns, counties, all public entities. I've not done any work in the private sector. I only work with municipalities, and I include counties under that general heading. All different sizes, from small towns the size of Dudley, to right now I'm currently finishing a study for the city of Worcester, Massachusetts. As you know, the second largest city in New England. The study I'm just finishing up in Worcester is for just the non-union employees, sort of put in perspective the size aspect of things. Well, the city of Worcester has about roughly 370 non-union positions. Just non-union. Putting aside the police, the fire, the DPW, all the union. Just in non-union, just to kind of put size in perspective. But there again, it doesn't make any difference, frankly, whether we're talking about 16 positions as we are, I think, here, or 370 in Worcester. The number one issue, again, is when I get to know how you're doing it today, invariably the number one issue is always lack of communication. So having said that, what I wanted to hand out, I think y'all should have copies of this one-page handout. Yeah, no, it's a one-page handout, that's the question here.
There should be extras.
We have
on
a
the
couple
end.
We
extras
have
over
some
here.
This is my quick and easy way of just simply sharing with you. When you see goal at the top of the page, the word goal means the purpose of the study. And goal, by definition, means it's ongoing. It doesn't automatically end unless you decide not to do it. Right? So the goal or purpose of the study that we're talking about today is to pay positions and employees, as I've already said. And I've highlighted or in italics, I've outlined or identified what I think are the two most important characteristics of describing the purpose of the study. So it's to pay positions and employees, the key word being fairly, or as I say here, consistently. The word consistent, by the way, means you can explain it. So paying positions and employees consistently, and then secondly, paying them competitively, quote unquote. Competitive means equitable. Competitive really needs to be defined so we understand what that term means. But those are the two standards. Those are the two characteristics that describe or really pertain to all aspects of compensation. One is doing it consistently, and secondly, doing it competitively, both in terms of how you pay positions and employees, and as it says in the one-sentence statement, to do it both internally, in other words, whether you look at it from a consistency or a competitive standpoint, both internally as well as externally, both within the town of Dudley, how positions and employees are paid, and secondly, how they compare to the marketplace. So it's both, okay? So that's the reason why you have a compensation plan. I don't think there's anything shocking or unusual about that. That applies to any organization, frankly. The other thing I highlight right up front, though, is the Massachusetts Pay Equity Act. And I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but Massachusetts, now almost 2 years ago, about a year and a half ago, passed a new law called the Massachusetts Pay Equity Act that pertains to paying men and women by gender. You have to do that equitably, quote unquote. And I think it's important for you to recognize as a personnel board, that is a new law, it's a new regulation, it's a new guideline that pertains to all municipalities as well as the private sector, frankly. So that one sentence is really the purpose of having a compensation plan to pay positions and employees. The 3 objectives you see there, those are the 3 things that we propose to do. So an objective by definition has a beginning and an end. It's specific, measurable, and time-bound. So what I'm suggesting or proposing to do when I submitted my proposal to the town, and these are in sequential order. So the first thing we're proposing to do is to write accurate job descriptions. Now, I haven't seen your current job descriptions. I don't know whether they're accurate or not. I haven't seen them. All I can say to you is that we have to have accurate job descriptions as the first objective, the first step in doing the study. And we'll come back in a minute to how we propose to do that. But the word accurate means 2 things. As it says right here, it means describing what an employee today is required to do, where he or she spends the bulk of their time. But it also means accurately describing, when we use the phrase minimum qualification, what we mean by that is the knowledge, the skill, or the ability someone needs to have in order to do what they do. Okay? So the 2 characteristics that define the word accurate are basically the minimum qualifications as well as where you spend the bulk of your time, your so-called essential functions. And if you have any questions, by the way, I don't mean to, I could, as you probably can already tell, I could ramble right on through this probably way too quickly. So stop me, please, if there's something I've said that doesn't make any sense or you just have a concern or question about. So once we've written job descriptions, then the next step is to develop a classification plan. And as I said earlier, the word classification means to compare positions to one another, not just based on dollars and cents. But as it says here on the handout, to compare them based on what are referred to as evaluation criteria. And I believe, John, correct me if I'm wrong, you have an evaluation system you've been using? Is that correct?
An evaluation system?
Yeah,
Yes.
Well, I'm talking about a position evaluation to determine how.
We
or
do.
you
It's
don't.
been in mothballs, but we do.
All right, so it is one, but you're not currently using it? Is that a fair statement, or?
I think it's fallen along the wayside a while ago, but
Right. Yeah, go ahead,
It
sir.
needs to be looked at.
Absolutely. I mean, we're gonna look at it, even if you were to tell me, yeah, we've got a system, it's great, we really think it works well, we're still gonna look at it.
we won't tell you that.
So one of my biggest challenges, by the way, as I think you can already begin to understand, is to get to know who you are today. In other words, how you're doing this today. Suffice it to say that based on my experience, I will get to know how you're doing it today, good, bad, or indifferently, very, very quickly. Okay? But based on how you're doing it today, the basic question, though, is, well, is there, when I say better, the word better is very subjective. It depends on, I guess, what your perspective might be. But minimally, better means doing it equitably, doing it consistently. Okay? No matter what aspect of compensation we're talking about. And once again, just keep in mind, the test, the so-called challenge relative to doing it better, is how well you can explain it, which another way to look at that is how well I understand it. If I'm an employee, do I understand how you're paying both the position I'm in as well as how you're paying me? What's the process? Okay? So the second objective is to develop a quote-unquote classification plan, which means grade levels in practical terms. And today you don't have that, as I understand it. You don't have grade levels. You don't really have, yes, sir.
We do have
That's a different aspect.
okay.
When you talk about steps, as we'll get to in the third objective, you're jumping ahead of me a little bit. Now you're talking about paying the employee,
Okay.
right? Initially, the first 2 objectives, one of the things that I think is really particularly important is for you to understand and hopefully agree, those first two objectives don't cost you a penny. There's no cost associated with writing a job description. There's no cost whatsoever associated with developing a classification plan by itself. You and I both know that cost doesn't come into play until obviously you hire someone and you pay them, right? I mean, so the cost comes into consideration or into the process when we talk about the third objective, which is the so-called compensation plan. And that's where we're talking about paying a position, and then secondly, paying an employee in the position, right? And again, I think that makes common sense. And by the way, when I just said it makes common sense, I don't mean to downplay or understate that. It's absolutely essential to managing compensation that everyone understand it. So the simpler it is, that's why consistency becomes so important. Frankly, then the easier it is for me to understand how this works. All right? So in developing a compensation plan, and again, compensation means both internally and externally. Although I say on the handout here that really compensation is meant to reflect external equity, whereas the classification plan is really primarily meant to reflect internal equity. Internal within the town of Dudley, external in comparison to the marketplace. Okay? And again, I know I'm repeating myself, but I'm intentionally trying to repeat myself. Whether we're talking internal equity, external equity, classification plan, compensation plan, anything and everything, with no exception, needs to meet those two standards I highlighted right at the beginning. Consistency, which again means fairness, and secondly, equitable, which means competitive. Okay? Internal and external. All right? So everything we do with regard to developing a classification compensation plan always, always, always needs to meet those two standards. If you don't, doesn't mean you have to. There's nothing, I didn't say you shall do it, but if you don't do it consistently, you should be able to explain why not. And again, I'm just giving you my opinion. You and I both know, ultimately, it's what the town of Dudley decides to do that really is important here, not what I may say or not say or whatever the case might be. It's what the town wants to do that's obviously the most, that is the important part of the study. So in developing a compensation plan, all I've done here is highlight what are basically the two components of it, right? First one I highlight is called what I call a hiring range. So when you go to hire a new employee, and now we are talking about the employee, so we are talking about cost. The first aspect of compensation is when you go to hire a new employee, how do you want to pay that position? And secondly, how are you going to pay the employee? And once you've hired someone, then the other question is what I call market equity. Another word to use besides market equity is retention, right? I come to work for the town of Dudley today, and then the question is, as we go forward, or as I go forward as an employee of the town, how am I going to be paid? Another way to describe that is how am I going to be retained from a compensation standpoint, right? So this is the study, all right? Writing a job description that's accurate, based on the job description, developing a classification plan, not primarily the market data. So one of the very important things I want to emphasize to you this morning is developing the classification plan is not primarily determined by the market data. It's primarily determined by the job description. Another way to say that is it's primarily determined by what the town of Dudley requires someone to do and what you require the employee to have in the way of knowledge, ability, and skill. That's what the employer, the town of Dudley, requires of an employee. That's the primary criteria to determine how to pay a position, not the market data. And the reason why I'm emphasizing it, I know today that's not how you're doing it. Mm-hmm. Why do I know that? Well, you really don't have a classification plan. That's a red flag to me. And when I first met with John and I said, well, show me how you're doing it today, or explain to me how you're doing it today, I didn't see a classification plan. Good, bad, or indifferent. All that says to me, is that you don't really have a way of paying positions other than by dollars and cents. Whether it's dollars and cents internal, external, or somewhere else. The point being that right now, dollars and cents, I think it's fair to say, is the primary criteria that the town is using to pay a position and secondly to pay an employee. Okay? So obviously what I'm suggesting to you this morning, what I'm proposing to do with you, and when I say with you, I'm obviously talking about the employees as well, is to develop a process that is determined, is really based on the three criteria, the three objectives you see outlined here. Writing an accurate job description, then developing a classification plan. And by the way, the check and balance to the classification plan is your organizational structure. So if I were to ask you to give me an org chart of the town of Dudley today, whether it's within a department or the town as a whole, and I don't really care whether it's union or non-union positions, to me that doesn't really make any difference. Who reports to whom? What's the hierarchy? So if you look at your police department or your town clerk, any department you want to look at, well, what's the hierarchy in terms of different levels of responsibility? Who reports to whom, right? From the highest level to the lowest level. As you'll see when we develop the classification plan, the number of grade levels, which we'll be able to explain to you, needs to be consistent. I guess that's where the word shall may come into play. Shall be consistent, has to be consistent with your organizational structure, whatever that might be. And obviously I don't know what that is today. I haven't been here before. I've been by it. I've never worked for the town of Dudley before. So I'm not familiar with your current organizational structure. But again, I'll get to learn that very, very quickly as we write job descriptions and I get to know and understand who reports to whom and who has what level of responsibility and so on, okay?
Are you involved in the job descriptions?
Oh, most definitely. So let me hold that thought for a second because I want to come back and just quickly outline how we're going to do that, all right? But everything we do in this study is primarily my responsibility. I'm the project manager. It's my responsibility to make sure that this study is done properly, effectively, timely, and so on. It's 100% my responsibility. I have other people that work with me or for me that help me write job descriptions and help me collect market data. So I don't want you to think, in some ways I'm a how do I say it? I am who I am. I'm a sole proprietor kind of thing. But obviously, depending upon the size of the study, the number of positions, the number of employees, and so on, I have other individuals that help me. And I've outlined in my proposal, I think I said there's one other individual right now. This is a relatively small study. 16 position titles in the grand scheme of things is not a very big study, but that's neither here nor there. When I look at 16 position titles, the question I ask myself is what help do I need in order to get that done? And the most time-consuming aspect of doing this study, without a question, is writing the job description, talking to your employees, which we propose to do. And I'll come back to that in a second. So any questions about the three objectives? Time frame wise, just to put it in perspective for you, today's the beginning of the study. We're meeting with employees today. From here, the next step is, as I've already said, is to write the job descriptions. That roughly takes, depending upon how quickly we either have employees fill out a questionnaire or they can mark up their current job description, whichever way they feel comfortable telling us what they do and what they feel their minimum qualifications are. Once we get that information back, which usually comes to us in the form of a questionnaire, it typically takes us a week or two, if that, to write those draft descriptions. So figure a week or two to write a draft description, then we send it back to the employee, we ask them to review it, and then we come back and we meet with them. So that's the second step in writing the job description. We'll literally come back and we will meet with each individual employee privately. Now I say we propose, obviously everything is subject to employees being comfortable doing it. Right? We can only recommend, propose to do something, but the best way for us to talk to the employees is to, one, meet with them as a group, which we plan to do this morning, and then come back and meet with them individually to talk about their specific position. If for no other reason, really two reasons. One, to make sure they're comfortable, and that's the best word I could use, and giving them an opportunity to tell us what they think, about their job today. And then secondly, to help them make sure they understand the process. So we'll go out of our way, we'll take the time. Remember I said communication is the number one issue, by far. If I learned anything when I first started doing this 20 years ago, the quickest way not to do this effectively is to not take the time at the first step to talk to your employees. And to make sure that you as a personnel board, your board of selectmen, or for that matter, any other appointing authority, everyone and anyone needs to understand the process and needs to agree to it. There can be no one, I mean, nobody, that one, doesn't understand the process, hopefully, and secondly, in understanding it, you agree to it. You can always change what you do and how you do it, but there should be no misunderstanding at all relative to how we're doing this. Because ultimately, once there's a plan that's presented to you, and again, the plan's gonna consist of two parts, grade levels and salary ranges. That's the plan, so to speak. We're gonna ask the town to approve a set of policies that describe how we've done the study. So when the study's completed, you're gonna have a set of written guidelines, a set of written criteria that describe anything and everything we've done, from writing a job description, to surveying the marketplace, to developing salary ranges, and so on. Anything and everything we'll do in conducting the study, we're gonna give to you in writing. And hopefully, if it's a plan that you feel is good for you and good for the town, and the employees hopefully feel the same way, you'll adopt them. You'll put them in writing, so that one of the things that, one of my concerns in doing this type of work is that you don't have to go through this process again. I mean, you can always periodically bring someone in to, as an outsider or objectively to review what you've been doing. But the process you've been doing this, what I'm suggesting to you this morning, should be put in writing. And that enables you to do this consistently, like anything else. And I know, if I were to ask you to tell me what you do and how you do it, well, there's four of you right now, you may have four different opinions. Not to say you don't work well together or anything, but if you don't have a set of written guidelines describing what you do, well, it's subject to your interpretation, subject to your opinion, right? And that's only natural. What I'm suggesting to you, in order to do this consistently, putting something in writing like this, in other words, how you pay positions and employees, can only help you. But it also will help the employee. So when it's all said and done, it's a true win-win situation. I'm of the opinion that if the town of Dudley is going to change how you've been doing this up until now, if you don't think it's a benefit to you or to the town, it's not going to happen, obviously. Why would you want to change? Well, guess what? The same question applies to your employees. What I'm suggesting to you, if they feel it's good for them, they don't get to make the final decision, obviously, as an employee, but I think it's absolutely essential. Remember, I said for them to understand and agree to the process just as it is for you, no differently, frankly, other than you play different roles. But if they understand how it's working in terms of how it affects them personally, and if they think it's going to help them, if it's a win for them or a win for me individually, and I know common sense would tell you that the odds are pretty good I'm going to want to do it, right? Not just be told to do it, but I'm going to want you to do it. I mean, just stop and think about that. As opposed to the town dictating and telling the employee how they're going to be paid, I'm suggesting to you have a process that frankly goes up and down, from bottom up or top down, but we all agree to the process. To me, that's the ideal. That's the best way to do this, is to have everybody understand the process and everyone agree to it. Whether you're in a bargaining group or not, that's not the issue. So once we've met with employees to review the draft job description, we'll then go back and make any changes after we've met with them, and we'll send it back to them for the second time, for them to review it. And at that step in the basically what amounts to a 3 or 4 step process in writing an accurate job description, we'll ask the employee and the department head, whoever the manager of the department is, or whoever they report to sign a document, what we call an acknowledgement form, that the draft description, with or without additional changes, is quote-unquote accurate. And I say the word accurate intentionally. We don't ask employees to approve anything. Okay, so don't misunderstand me, please. What we are asking employees to tell us what they think is accurate. The only one that approves a job description is the town. Okay? And there's no, hopefully, misunderstanding about that. So that first objective, writing that accurate job description, basically takes, let's say, within 30 days, just to give a rough time frame. Don't hold me to 30, please. Oh, you're at day number 28. So roughly within about a month, give or take, and it probably would be less than that, frankly. Then we will have written an accurate job description for every position in the study. And then at the same time, once we're doing that, once I know what the employees are thinking and your department heads are thinking, then we'll begin to develop the classification plan. So roughly, if you look at both those first two objectives, let's say within roughly no more than 2 months, no more than 60 days, and again, I'm sure it'll be less than that, we will have completed the first two objectives. Now, the other thing I want to mention to you today is in anticipation of developing the compensation plan, we want to be able to get a salary survey instrument out the door as soon as we can, because it frankly just takes a little while to collect that data. And so one of the questions I had for you this morning is for you to give some thought to how you want to see us, meaning me, do the salary survey. If there are particular communities that you have a concern about, for whatever the reason, obviously I don't know what those concerns might be, if you have any, whether it's based on how you've done it in the past or how you want to do it today. Whatever it might be, all I'm asking you to do today is just let Jonathan know what any concerns you might have in that regard. We're asking the employees the same question. Yes, sir.
Where do you normally gather your information from? Do you get it from the Massachusetts Municipal Association?
No.
Where do you get your information?
My assurance to you is that I will collect my data. The only reason I say no about the Massachusetts, it's the MMA, the Massachusetts Municipal Association, is that I can't vouch for where they got their data from. Doesn't mean we won't look at it if it's available. But the bottom line is, when I show you market data, I need to be able to tell you where I got it from and who I got it from. All right, so whether it's the town of Webster or anywhere else, I need to assure you, one, that I've collected the data, and secondly, I know where I got it from. Right, so professional associations are another good example. Town clerks, treasurer collectors, they all have their associate accountants in Massachusetts have associations like that. And they periodically, building inspectors all the time do salary surveys amongst their peers, and I'm happy to look at it. It doesn't mean I don't want to see it or I don't want to understand it, but the bottom line is that I want to be able to I have to vouch for the data I use to assure you that I know where it's come from. So the way we do salary surveys, which I think is a good question, I'm glad you asked it, we do it really basically on two criteria. One is demographic. So to compare the town of Dudley to the city of Worcester, 180,000 versus, what's Dudley today?
11.
7?
About 12 and
Oh, 12,000,
change.
yeah. Hey, you're bigger than, I never realized Dudley was that big. I don't mean anything negative about that. So 12,000 to 180,000, and I know, that's probably not who you're competing against, quote unquote. But having said that, if you were to tell me, well, we really want to compare the town of Dudley to the city of Worcester, we're happy to collect data from anyone, frankly. Because that's not the most important question. The most important question is, once you've collected data, do you want to use it, right? So the first criteria is demographics. So ideally, what I mean by demographic is population, per capita income, budget size, or number of employees, what have you. But the second criteria we use that, frankly, I've learned over the years is more important than demographic criteria is operational criteria. So describing who you are, if you were to pick a department in the town of Dudley, you typically wouldn't describe who that department is. Let's use your highway department, or do you call it public works? Highway. So how you would describe your highway department today is really based on what the highway department does today here in the town of Dudley. What are the services, what are the operational criteria that would tell you, me, and anyone else who that department is? Town clerk department. Well, you might use operational criteria like the number of polling places or the number of registered voters, which is a demographic criteria. But the point is that you really would probably use both. And so that's how we do the salary survey. We don't have any predetermined number. Remember, keep in mind, the critical issue about the salary survey is the quality of the data, not the quantity. It's not how many places you compare to. I can't tell you how many municipalities. I just can't remember. I don't think you did this. Did you say in the RFP, you didn't say how many places had to be surveyed, did you?
No.
I don't think you did.
No.
Believe it or not, when I've read some of the RFPs when the city or town issues it, they say, well, we need you to survey 10 places. And I always say, well, how'd you get 10? Yeah, where'd that number come from? You stop and think about it, the more places you survey, frankly, the common sense aspect of it is the greater the likelihood is maybe the data's not going to be accurate. Not necessarily means that will happen, but the point very simply being, it's not how many places you survey, right? So irregardless of whether you have concerns or not, whether employees have concerns, or for that matter, any other appointing authority has a concern, we'll let you know before we do the salary survey who we're actually going to be surveying. In other words, my commitment to you, as it is to the employees, no surprises. I want you to know what I'm doing before I do it. The win for me in that regard is so that you don't come back and tell me, one, you didn't ask me or tell me. So that shouldn't happen. Hopefully it won't happen. But secondly, if you do have a question or concern, the earlier on in the study that I know about it, the better I'm able to work with you or resolve the issues. I don't want to wait till the end of the study and say, well, you know, we surveyed the town of Southbridge for this position, and then have you say to me, you did what? Why'd you do that? Well, you know and I know, well, the credibility of the whole study that gets thrown into question. And frankly, when I started doing this 20 years ago, I didn't realize that. I had some studies that sort of hit a wall for that one reason, so obviously I don't make that mistake again. All right, so again, just keep in mind what I would encourage you, the question I would encourage you to ask is, yeah, it's important for you to know who we've surveyed for a particular position, but I think what's more important, I think a more accurate question, more specific question, is how are you going to use the data, the market data? All right, and you'll get to know that, you'll see that once we present the compensation plan to you. So essentially, I guess the last thing I wanted to say to you is once we've completed the first two objectives, and Jonathan and I talked about this last week, I already recognize where I'm coming from. One of my concerns right up front, it's easy for me to sit here and say to you, we're going to develop a classification plan. Well, I understand that you don't have one today. So when I look at the town of Dudley today in terms of, as I get to know how you're doing this today, doing this means how you're paying positions and how you're paying employees. Well, I already know you don't have a classification plan. That's a significant change. That's a major red flag to me. What I'm saying to you this morning is I'm going to come back to you with a plan. And you're going to see a grade level plan. So obviously it's critically important from my perspective for you to, one, know how I've done it, and secondly, for you to ultimately decide that it's in the town's best interest to approve it, to do it, to implement it, right? Which gets back to why understanding the process, I think you can begin to understand, is so critically important. And again, I guess the other issue I just wanted to say right up front, as I already indicated, the first two objectives don't cost the town any money. Yet I already know that cost is a critical issue here, as it is everywhere. Particularly under Prop 2.5 and everything. I understand that money is tight and always will be. That's why I submitted to you, or suggested earlier, that the more important question from my perspective is, once you decide how much you can afford to spend, in this case on paying employees, I think the other question that unfortunately does not get asked, at least not to my understanding, is what's the best way to spend that money? And I will ask you that question. I'll ask you to think about that, and I'll ask the town to decide, once we've developed a plan, what's the best way for you going forward to spend the money, once you've determined how much. So I haven't been asked to look at that. That's not part of my study. I could do it, and I would welcome the opportunity, but that's not what I'm here to do. All right, I'm not here to evaluate or determine or recommend or suggest or even really look at how much you can afford to spend. That's not part of the study, okay? And that's a common misunderstanding, frankly, in doing this type of work. Sometimes people think this is really all about cost. So depending upon what side of the table you're sitting on, if you're on your side, you can't afford anything. And if on my side, the employee side, I want more. And neither one of them really are specific or germane to really the primary purpose of the study. Yeah, that comes up. That is the bottom line. That is the issue going forward. But the way I like to describe it is in the context of, there's lots of ways to spend money. All right. The question is, what's the best way? Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit about the hiring range
Sure.
and how you're going to come up with a competitive pay band. The reason I'm asking that is because we have tried in the past to be somewhat competitive as best we can when hiring new employees. And then when we've done that, that kind of kicked us in the tail a little bit because we bring in a new employee that's earning more money than somebody who's been here for 3 years.
Yeah, very good point. And that's an internal equity, by the way.
Yes.
You know, what you just
How are
described.
you going to deal with that issue?
Yeah, that's a critical question. Well, again, no matter what aspect we're talking about, again, I always like to go back to the beginning and say we're going to deal with it consistently. And again, as I've said before, and I've already said it several times, we're going to be able to explain it, all right? So specifically, I mean, to answer your question, on the one hand, well, we basically use 3 criteria. I think the best way to answer your question is to share with you a little bit about our methodology. The way I've learned to deal with that issue of competitiveness, internally and externally, both, is to use 3 criteria to define the word competitive. First one is the market data. So what I'm saying to you is, yes, we will use market data to help us define the word competitive, again, as it relates to the position of the employee. Secondly, we're going to use the current rate of pay of the employee, whatever that might be, in their current position. And the third criteria we're going to use is years of service in the position. In other words, when I understand how much individual employees are being paid today, whatever their rate of pay might be. And by the way, the key criteria there that I may or may not have mentioned before, my understanding is what we're talking about this morning are all of your so-called regular positions. Regular means requiring an employee to work 52 weeks a year. I may work 20 hours a week, you may work 30, but we're both in regular positions because we both are required to work 52 weeks a year. So if I'm in a position today that does not require the employee to work 52 weeks a year, my suggestion, my recommendation would be to put that type of position, or the employee for that matter, in a separate compensation plan. Your so-called temporary positions, the word temporary usually is defined just the opposite of what I just said. You pay somebody when you require them to work, but you don't require them to work 52 weeks a year. All right, you may pay them a stipend, you may pay them an hourly rate of pay, or a fixed rate of pay, however you do it, but usually the basic criteria to be in a regular position is that 52-week a year requirement, okay? So we'll use those 3 criteria, market data, rate of pay of the employee in the current position, and years of service in the current position. And along with those 3 criteria, we'll recommend a policy, in other words, how to use those 3 criteria. And so the simple answer to your question is, we're going to use, and we use specifically the midpoint of the survey data we'll collect. You'll see, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of the game here, when we present to you the market data relative to how we're going to recommend using the market data to develop a compensation plan, what we do is we rule out the lows and the highs of the data we collect, and we focus on the midpoint. So depending upon what data we collect, and once we've grouped or classified positions, we'll rule out the lows and the highs of the data, and we'll use the midpoint. Sometimes people call that the mean or the median, whichever way you want to define it. The point is the middle, okay? And the reason why we do it that way is that the market data is all over the place. It's not that reliable. So one of the ways to deal with the discrepancy, or the disparity, I should say, of the market data is to focus on the middle of it, the midpoint, all right? It just makes it easier. And we also, when we collect the data, we average it, which is not surprising. I mean, I think everybody does that. And the reason why we average the data, again, is to rule out the, disparity, the spread, the differences for the market data for one position versus another, okay? And the other reason to keep in mind why we do it that way is that we're trying to always emphasize that the most important criteria in paying the position, as I said earlier, again, is not the market data. So really, in a sense, if you stop and think about it, what I'm suggesting this morning is that we're trying to de-emphasize the importance of it, for the simple reason that it's just not that accurate. It is what it is, right? You can think of 1,000 reasons, and every one of them probably would be right, why that market data is not that accurate. So, with that understood, the other way to look at market data, I guess, is to say, well, you know, when you go to hire somebody to fill a new position, or when you go to pay a current employee in a particular position, who are you competing against? Now, I don't assume for a minute that the town of Dudley wants to be competitive. Now, and I appreciate what you said a minute ago. It's nice to hear that you think it's important for the town of Dudley to pay employees competitively. What's missing today is a way to do that consistently. And I would submit to you that is one of our objectives, as I've already indicated, is to develop a way to do that. I happen to be of the opinion that competitiveness is critically important to managing compensation effectively. Doesn't mean you have to, right? There's nothing that says you shall pay employees or positions competitively. That's your decision as the employer. I always like to use the analogy of, my favorite analogy is always to use, everyone knows who Bill Belichick is, right? I have to be careful when I say that in another state, believe me. I don't want to go there. But every NFL football team, here's a question for you, right? Every team has 2 tackles, 2 guards, and a center, right? If you follow football at all. Trust me, they do. And on every single football team, I'm talking about the National Football League, one of those linemen is paid more than all the others. Question is, which one? Any guess? Any idea? How many people saw the movie Blindside? Remember that movie a few years ago? No? Didn't see that movie? You saw
Long
it?
time ago,
Yeah. Well, do you remember what it was about?
vaguely.
I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Vaguely.
What it was all about was this guy that ultimately wound up in the pros, and he played left tackle. Stop and think about, when Tom Brady throws a pass, which hand does he throw from? He's right-handed. Where's his blind side? The left side, right? Try to throw a football or a baseball or whatever. If you're right-handed, and just about every NFL quarterback happens to be right-handed, their blind side is the left side. So the most important lineman of all the others is obviously to protect that blind side. They're usually paid, not usually, they are paid, I don't know how much, but they're the biggest. If you look at these guys, they're all huge, but the biggest one usually is your left tackle. The best blocker out there is typically your left tackle. That's not based on demographic criteria, that's based on operational criteria. The skill aspect of what they do and how they do it. That's the best analogy I can share with you that comes to my mind anyway, relative to compensation. So when it's all said and done, what I'm asking the town to do is to determine, hopefully, that you think paying positions and employees is important to the town of Dudley. Again, it's not how much. That's not part of the study. But I would submit to you that internally, what's missing today in a compensation plan like you have, and by the way, your compensation plan today is almost 100%, and I haven't actually seen all the rates of pay, but as I said before, my understanding is you don't have established grade levels, which really means you have a dollars and cent driven compensation plan today. That's typically of what I see everywhere. That's the city of Worcester right now. Even though they're a lot bigger than the town of Dudley, when I asked them to explain to me how they're doing it today, literally, the only way they could explain it was by dollars and cents. What's completely missing, it's not part of the equation, as it is here, is that whole issue about knowledge, ability, and skill to determine how to pay the position, let alone pay the employee, right? So we'll get to the point with a plan in front of you, grade levels and salary ranges. Then the question becomes one of how to pay the employee. So your hiring range, all I'm suggesting is just that. When you go to hire a new employee, what I found to work very well is within that salary range, establish a hiring range. But the other key word to keep in mind, by the way, is the word flexibility. You want to have the flexibility, I think, as an employer, to decide ultimately what's in the town's best interest. You don't want to have your hands tied or not have any flexibility to determine what you think is the best thing to do for the town. So even though I'm suggesting we're going to establish or recommend establishing a hiring range, At the same time, you want to have the flexibility to hire a new employee above the hiring range if you determine that's what's in the town's best interest. Okay? So I don't want you to think that every new employee has to be hired. Remember, the key word is range, by the way. And not having a range for your position today makes your job 100 times more difficult relative to determining, let's say, how to pay a new employee and avoid the issue you mentioned a minute ago.
Okay, does your study, is that also going to include employees that I would consider have skill-based skills that can do multitasking within the town hall?
Yeah, when we get to the point where we're ready to talk about how to pay the employee, that's one of the questions that I'm going to ask the town. Is, ideally, my recommendation to you is absolutely to include the knowledge, skill, or ability. Let me say those three words with one word. I simply combine them all together and say, based on responsibility. I think responsibility is a valid, critical way to pay employees more money. Right now, you don't use that criteria, or at least I'm not sure if you may do it with some people, but not with others. Again, I'm not sure how you're doing it. And I don't mean that negatively or critically. I'm just saying I just don't know. So I would submit to you that when we get to the point where we're ready to talk about employees, you'll have a plan in front of you. Again, the word plan means grade levels and ranges. And then the question of paying employees more money. Off the top of my head, I can think of at least 5 or 6 different ways to pay somebody more money right now. Doesn't mean you're going to want to do it 5 or 6 different ways. You may decide to do it 2 or 3 ways. And I'm talking about, for a good example is cost of living. A lot of places, a lot of municipalities say, well, we're going to pay people more money, and we're minimally going to give everybody a quote-unquote cost of living increase. Assuming that it actually is cost of living, which most often it's not, but they call it that, right? I don't know what you guys have been doing here, but cost of living is just one of those 5 or 6 ways to pay people more money. And again, I only submit to you, whatever the criteria are you use to pay people more money, it's all add them all up. The criteria are really intended to, again, pay employees consistently, and I would submit to you to do it competitively, internally and externally. So if you keep in mind, if nothing else, and I'm sharing with you one of my biases, one of my opinions, is the distinction between exempt and non-exempt positions, right from the get-go. And again, most of the municipalities that I work with, in fact, almost every one of them, have an extremely difficult time. In fact, don't make that distinction. I would submit to you that's an absolutely essential distinction for you to make. Let me say that to you a different way. If I'm in a position that requires me to manage, to plan what to do, and I'm held accountable, I always like to pick on police chiefs. I don't know why I think that way. It's my old town manager. You can't get that out of me. But if I'm in a position that requires me to plan how this department's going to function, and you're going to hold me accountable, that's another way of saying I've taken on risk, right? I assume you all agree with me. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to pay me more money the same way as all these other employees that work for me, that don't have to plan what to do, how do you think I feel about that? I don't feel too good, because I don't think that's fair. So just keep in the back of your mind, if you don't mind, this whole issue about exempt and non-exempt, required to plan versus ones that aren't. Minimally, that's, I think, a very, very valid, that's my personal opinion. And I've already said 90% of the municipalities that I work with, for whatever their reasons, don't agree with that principle or concept. And I don't know why, other than they just don't want to do it. I don't know what you want to do. I'm only suggesting to you today that when we talk about the employee part of this, so the first step, what I'm suggesting, should be for you to understand, of these, let's say, 16 positions, they're not all the same, obviously. Some of them have more responsibility than others. And we're going to recommend a process to measure that, so we do it consistently. Then whether you want to use it or not, or implement it, again, obviously, is the town's prerogative. So did that answer your question?
Out of time, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. I hate to cut you off.
No, I'm sorry, I know, obviously.
Okay, but I know Fred has to go and tape another meeting.
Yeah.
Before I finish, citizens' comments?
I just had one quick question, Mr. Chairman, through you, maybe to the
Yes.
And depending on when this is finished, does this have to go to town meeting for a vote, or will the selectmen approve it?
Selectmen approve it.
And will that become part of the general policy of the board, personnel board? Will it be in their bylaws?
If it's recommended and accepted by the selectmen, it sure will, yeah.
So the overall timeframe, which I didn't finish, you just reminded me, appreciate that. I had mentioned 30 days, so within 60 days, you'll have a job, right?
Okay.
The other part will be the developing the comps. So basically, within no more than 60 to 90 days at the most, you'll have a completed plan.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you very much for talking about the plan, talking about your expertise and what you plan on doing for the town of Dudley, because it's important to us.
I appreciate that.
Jonathan, any comments?
No, I just, I think that by going out to RFP, we've eliminated any internal distraction that we've had in the past when we've tried to do this, and we brought in an independent person to do the study. Certainly a person who's done quite a few of them, and we'll just have to see how it falls.
Okay.
One more quick question, if I may. So would this be an opportunity for department heads to rewrite job descriptions for a clerk? Or are you hoping that?
Well, I mean,
What,
I think it's an opportunity, Mr. Chairman, to take a look, like Lisa's was coming with a new job description to be not approved, but at least taken into the record today. It would be a redundancy of the same exact work that's gonna happen for every non-union position in the town
okay,
hall.
about a year ago, we asked all the departments within town hall to submit us like new copy of their job descriptions.
And updated.
And they've done that. Now I believe they're gonna take those job descriptions, bring it to your office for study.
Right.
And comparison to what people say they're doing now to see if there are any changes or any updates. So I would assume that if things have changed within that year's period of time, that everything would be updated and reconsidered. Yes, yes, yes.
Well, I mean, everything's gonna be considered. I would say that everybody in this building is gonna have a new job description by the time we're done. It doesn't mean that it's gonna be, that they're gonna be given more duties. I think it's gonna be just a more
Precise.
accurate, precise, and qualified job description, as opposed to trying to back into a position or an upgraded position. We're gonna survey exactly what the qualifications, what the responsibilities, what the duties are now, and we're gonna use that data to study it, classify it, and pay it appropriately. Right?
Okay. Any board members' comments? Joan? Okay. We will go down to our item 7A. Our next meeting will be February 18th at 9 o'clock in this office, and I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Make a motion to adjourn.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.